Understanding Criminal Psychology. Introduction. In our fourth module, we shall begin by looking at the criminal process in its simplest form and what can be gleaned by looking at the nuances of a crime, which gives us a clearer idea of the potential psychology of a crime's perpetrator. Following this, we delve into their psychology in detail. Topics to be covered in this module are the criminal process, varieties of crime, explanations of crime, crime psychology research, areas of contribution. The criminal process. Criminality is a process, and it can be helpful to understand criminal activity this way instead of as an action by a particular kind of person. A criminal, or a group, will commit an act, but this is not an example of the criminal process in its entirety. In its simplest form, the process would look like this. A person or people carries out an illegal act. This act may have its root in earlier experiences, but we will delve into this later. Other crimes may be associated with this illegal act, making the above part an ongoing process of criminality. Once the illegal act has been committed, there are usually victims and witnesses, and so the act is reported and law enforcement enters the process. The police begin their investigation. The study of criminals is a fascinating and complex field, and a true understanding needs to be taken into account. That psychologists take an individual as their focus instead of looking at larger outside factors such as the economy, politics, or society as a whole. What they learn, they must learn from the crimes committed by the offender. Crime statistics tend to come under the purview of sociologists studying crime. Unless a criminal is apprehended, they cannot be studied, and when it comes to certain crimes, this may mean we have a skewed idea of who the perpetrators are. Two examples at different ends of the spectrum. Number 1. Burglaries. Less than 1 in 10 burglaries result in an arrest. It's important to consider whether the burglars that are caught are simply the most incompetent or whether they are an accurate representation of the remainder. Number 2. Murder. In the developed world, 95% of murderers are apprehended, which gives us a much clearer idea of the psychology behind this act. There are other types of crime besides burglary that have proven difficult to study. These are: Number 1. Arson for profit. It is exceedingly difficult to detect certain kinds of arson, such as one that has been carefully planned by a failing business to make money off of their insurance. Number 2. Rape and sexual assault. Proving whether or not there has been consent in these situations makes it difficult to get a clear idea of who rapists are. Investigative psychology. This is another way to delve into the actions of the criminal through which focuses on the actions of criminals. Information can be gleaned from witness and victim statements, court reports, direct contact with the offender, and police reports. The psychology of crime must engage with the institutions and agencies that recognize the illegal activities of the criminal. There are a variety of institutions and agencies, each of which has different goals and handles different tasks. The police. We can view them as the initial agency. Their focus is on the criminal act, gathering evidence relating to it, and then catching the offender. The law courts. Their focus is on who is guilty and judging how serious the offense is. Prison authorities and other equivalents. Incarceration is the punishment we are familiar with, but a criminal may find themselves sent to a probation service or to one of a multitude of other support services. Varieties of crime. To get to grips with the psychology of crime, we need to be aware of the wide variety of actions that can fall under the banner of criminalism. If we break down each crime into subgroups, we will find a great deal of variation. Burglary. This can be anything from purse snatching on the streets to the theft of valuable works of art from a high-security warehouse. Fraud. This can cover signing a check for an account that is not your own to the large-scale abuse of pension funds. Murder. This could come about due to a violent, unplanned outburst or because of a meticulously followed plan, with the aim of killing for profit. It is exceedingly unlikely that the same psychological issues are behind each of these acts. Defining crime. Whether an act is a crime is not straightforward to define, as it is down to how the legal and cultural structures in a given country interpret an action that makes something criminal. If you're defending yourself, or you're a soldier in a war, it is unlikely that you will be prosecuted for murder. There is rarely a psychological basis to how the crimes are legally defined. If someone were to commit arson to hide a different crime, this would be classified in the same way as if the arson had been an act of revenge. When studies are carried out on the characteristics of a criminal, they will usually use the legal definition of the crime they committed rather than a subtler explanation that more accurately describes what they did and why. It is always important to dig into the subsets of an offense. Otherwise, your understanding of the psychological process behind it will be flawed. Focusing on a subset of a crime and investigating what motivated it may yield several motives, all of which are correct. A criminal may have committed a crime both because he hates women because of how his mother treated him, as well as to impress his gang or affiliates. Explanations of crime. Differentiating the types of crimes and criminals is key to explaining crime. And with this technique, we start to find psychological explanations for criminality. Before delving into this in detail, it is important to note that there is no correlation between mental illness and criminality. Some studies have wrongly indicated otherwise due to their focus on clinical populations. When criminal examinations have been from a psychiatric or clinical psychological perspective, they have tended to focus on criminals as the extremes, such as serial rapists, serial arsonists, or serial killers. Extremes of cases and individuals can lend bias to studies and can give false impressions that are often proven to be untrue. Volume crime. The majority of literature on criminality focuses on delinquents and those that carry out what is often referred to as volume crime. Volume crime can include burglary, theft, or car crime. Criminologists and clinical psychologists have come to different conclusions about the causes of crime, as they're talking about two completely different groups. Effects of mental illness. Gauging how great an effect mental illness can have on criminality has proven exceedingly difficult. A previous report showed 10 to 78% of inmates had a mental disorder, an exceedingly broad range. At the higher end, this is a much larger number than would be expected from the population at large. An earlier study showed that those suffering from schizophrenia and personality disorder were more likely to commit violent crimes and general criminality compared to those without these disorders. Those with schizophrenia could be more likely to be caught because of their condition. be more likely to find themselves in situations that appear criminal, even if they're not, be more likely to come from a criminogenic environment. Criminogenic, a system, situation, or place causing or likely to cause criminal behavior.
Measuring how great an effect personality disorder has on criminality is more difficult. It has been widely shown that those classified as psychopathic are much more likely to be involved in criminality. It is possible that the definitions for psychopathy and how we test for it mean we are simply measuring and labeling chronic criminals rather consistently diagnosing a disorder.
Socio-psychological aspects of crime. What we continue to come back to is the import of considering the social psychological aspects of crime alongside our study of an individual's character. Generally, offending is part of a social process, such as a burglar entering a person's property, a violent fray between two groups, the distribution and sale of drugs across a large network. Many criminals grow up within a criminal society and are absorbed into it at a young age. For many, the act of breaking the law is a norm, and they do not see it as immoral. Social perspectives of crime. By looking at crime from a social perspective, we are forced to consider an offender's own understanding of the acts in which they're involved. An example of this is domestic violence, which may not be the product of one person with psychological issues, and instead could be a deeply dysfunctional relationship in which both people involved have a warped idea of what is appropriate. A social perspective on crime also highlights that we need a greater understanding of social networks, such as the various ways criminals communicate, how their cliques are formed, and the part that significant individuals have to play in shaping an offender. Unfortunately, there are relatively few studies in this area. Crime psychology research. There is a lot of data available relating to crime psychology. In the next few slides, we will break down what is out there, who it is compiled by, and what the advantages and disadvantages are. Official records. All over the world, police authorities and other justice departments publish records of the local crimes. These records are readily available. Advantages. They specify the exact date on which an offense was committed. The official nature of the records means they play a big part in policy making. Disadvantages. This data makes up a small percentage of the crimes that are committed. The data tends to lack detail when it comes to both the individuals and the crimes themselves. Police data. This is made up of witness and victim statements, photographs from the crime scene, relevant geographical information, and police interviews. This data is less readily available, as the police do not share it without good cause. Advantages. Details about the crime may not be available elsewhere. The information will have been collected based on the requirements of the law, and so should be quite thorough. Disadvantages. A large proportion of crimes go unreported. The data is collected for evidence and official records, not for psychological research. The information is collected and collated differently depending on the police force, making comparisons difficult. Victim surveys. A very useful data source is victim surveys, such as the British Crime Survey, BCS, which is the largest adult victim survey in the UK. Advantages. These surveys may give us a better idea of the frequency with which people find themselves victims of crime. Disadvantages. Potential samples are biased, as some groups are under-researched, such as male rape victims or levels of rape within vulnerable groups like the homeless. The surveys rarely go into detail about the crime. Trauma from the crime may mean victims' accounts are distorted. There is no information about those that committed the crime. Clinical studies of victims. These studies tend to use medical notes from special referral centers, by which we mean sexual assault referral centers, SARCs, and hospitals. Notes on violent crimes can give a clearer idea about the victims and what they experience. Confidentiality issues may limit what researchers can access. Advantages. Because many victims do not report crimes to the police, medical centers' results may give a better representation of how often these kinds of attacks happen. Disadvantages. These centers are usually urban, so do not represent what is happening in rural areas. Medical centers have different approaches to clinical evaluation, making comparisons difficult. Offender interviews. For research purposes, an offender may be interviewed. This is usually done in prison or in clinical settings. Some offenders, such as terrorists, may be difficult or even impossible to access. Advantages. These interviews can help answer the motivations and self-justifications behind an offender's criminality. What a researcher discovers may help design therapeutic programs for similar groups or individuals. Disadvantages. The offenders are not reliable, as they may distort or lie about events to get an early release or lesser sentence. The researchers will only have the offender's side of the story unless other records are made available. Court reports. Court proceedings are usually a matter of public record. More and more, these can be found online or through subscription services. Advantages. Details about the offender and the crime are readily available. Information from many different jurisdictions is easily accessible. Disadvantages. Information deemed unimportant to a court case will not appear in the public record. Only crimes that come to the court are available. Published open sources in the mass media. Due to the public's interest in crime, plenty of information can be found in newspapers, criminals, autobiographies, crime blogs, and many other sources, all of which can be found on the internet. Advantages. The information is accessible to all and covers criminality all around the globe and from every century. Disadvantages. The papers will only publish what is newsworthy. The accuracy can be inconsistent. The crimes will usually be of a sensational nature. Areas of contribution. Criminal psychologists can be involved in a wide variety of activities, but the one for which they are the best known, but which is the most unusual for them to be attached, is offender profiling. TV shows and stories like The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes have helped to distort the importance and level of contribution a criminal psychologist has on an ongoing case. Although their contribution has been overstated, it can still be important. It is because of their contribution that the area of investigative psychology was created. An interesting area of note in this relatively new field is the psychology of the police, and consequently, questions about the challenges faced by investigators when making difficult decisions in challenging circumstances. It would be useful to know if particular kinds of individuals are better able to handle these situations than others. When a convict appears before a court, new psychological issues present themselves. Psychologists step in as expert witnesses to broadly do the following: Assess the mental state and capabilities of the defendant. Comment on the value and validity of the information presented before the court. In most jurisdictions, they must take great care not to offer their opinion on the guilt or innocence of the accused. Only the above points are in their purview. Because legal systems differ from country to country and from state to state, the exact role of the psychologist and how they go about giving their evidence will change based on the local jurisdiction. Offenders and psychologists. Criminal psychologists spend the majority of their time with convicted offenders. They will assess them and judge whether they are likely to reoffend, and will endeavor to provide them with support and treatment. Many offenders are themselves victims, which helps explain why the study and examination of victims sits under the banner of criminal psychology. A lot can be learned about crime when you take the time to consider the victims, as neither the criminals nor the victims are randomly distributed through the population. Summary. In this module, you have learned we may have a skewed understanding of who perpetrates certain crimes, such as burglary and arson for profit. There are a variety of institutions and agencies involved in the criminal process, such as the police and the law courts. There are nuances worth understanding about a crime beyond its initial label. Delving into the whys and wherefores of the act is important. Criminologists and clinical psychologists have come to very different conclusions about the causes of crime. We have considered crime from a social perspective and looked at criminality from the perspective of the offender.